The proposal is that no one in the country, black or white, do any Christmas shopping this year in order to burn into the conscience of this nation the meaning of the bombing of those children in Birmingham. It occurred in a Christian nation, and Birmingham is a part of America, and all of us, in one way or another, are responsible for it, and all of us are under the obligation, I think the moral obligation, not to let that have happened for nothing, to make it impossible for that to happen again in this country. And in terms of Christian businessmen, you may not be able to change their minds by talking about Christ or principles, but they do begin to get to the point if they begin to lose money.
Would you say this is a play about civil rights?
No, I would not say it's a play about civil rights. I think it's a play about a plague. The plague is, in my view, our concept of race and what that means and how that destroys. It doesn't only destroy Negroes. This is what people don't understand. It is a signal, it is a symptom of the American sense of reality. And this is a plague. And it destroys people's relationships with each other on every single level. And that is what the play is about. I want people to be uncomfortable. I want it to be personal for them. I want them to go home and think about it again. I want them to be disturbed. I also want them to have fun. You know, I want them to be alive. I want them to be moved.
Now, one of the reasons we have these black armbands, which we're asking every person who believes in justice to wear, these armbands will read, Birmingham children, white on black. This is one means of getting sufficient people wearing them so that, again, Mr. Kennedy knows something has to be done. One of the tragedies is that we are brutalized, and then they turn to us and ask us, what can you do to keep people nonviolent? Finally, we are prepared to say that the answer is there is nothing left for us to do. The responsibility is no longer ours. It is upon the government. And the greatest thing that could happen is being called for all over the world, not only here and not only by black men, is that those culprits be found. You cannot do such a bestial thing and expect people to remain calm. They will not. They are men. They have red blood in them.
Negroes with complaints about the portrayals of Negroes on the television and motion picture screens had a meeting in Hollywood. They admit that more Negroes are seen on the screen today than there were 1, 2, or 5 years ago, but they say that most still are seen in the roles of Aunt Jemima or Steppenfetchit, and they don't like it a bit. One of the speakers was director and actor Frank Silvera.
Many here recall a time when there was no such word as television, because there was no such instrument that required the label. There had been progress made, a great deal of progress made in human understanding and in living together. Consider when the Senate, and I have the full report of the Senate committee investigating crime, it became hot and the news got around and they went to work. And now there are monster shows on television. But no Negro. Monsters do not buy products. This nation knows the meaning of taxation without representation. That was the battle cry that started the American Revolution. But along with that, the knowledge of the meaning of tyranny was the knowledge of the action to counter it. Producer goods, consumer goods were dumped in Boston's harbor. I ain't gonna say no more. Thank you.
Frank was talking about the Negro not being in the picture. And it's perfectly true that if you turned on your TV set, if, for example, you descended from Mars or just come from Australia, you would be under the extraordinary impression that you're living in a white country. In the very same way that for generations now, white Americans, this republic has had the impertinence to talk about the South as though not a single black cat lived there. What we're talking about in the case of the South is a handful of nostalgic old men who have some money. That's what we mean by the South. And the television industry and the film industry is operating according to the same principle. Now, the nature of the crisis, I think, is that now this collision between, let us say, your leaders and my leaders is becoming for the first time apparent to the body politic.
Would you comment, sir, on Martin Luther King's approach as opposed to Malcolm X's approach to civil rights?
Well, speaking for myself, I happen to be very concerned about bloodshed. I don't want to see any more bloodshed. I happen to be much closer to Martin than I am to Malcolm.
Mr. Baldwin, ever since 1962, when you wrote The Fire Next Time, you've been considered the prophet of violence in the Black Revolution. How far do you think a writer should go in participating in such a revolution?
Well, let's put it more accurately. I was not so much the prophet of violence in the black community as I was indicating to white people especially what the result of their violence would inevitably be. As far as the question of being a writer or a participant is concerned, as time has gone on, don't feel that there's a tremendous distance between the two. To write, you have to be responsible for what you've written, and take the consequences for things you've seen, felt, thought, disseminated. You can't unwrite it, and you can't change your mind, even if you wanted to. And a revolution, I think Americans are very confused about this particular aspect of what is possibly not yet a revolution, but certainly the beginning of the end of the America that we have known. People are always talking about the violence of black people, and what I really want to make clear before I go any further into that is that it's a great mistake to suppose that people are going to endure what Americans have forced black people to endure without some kind of repercussion, without some kind of reaction. I don't think that the American people are very well placed to decry violence, since they themselves are the most violent people in the world. And in fact, I will go so far as to say that I think that, insofar as black people have reacted or resisted or have made known to their countrymen and to the world that the situation is intolerable, but on the whole, black people have behaved with extraordinary restraint. Is considering precisely that, first of all, that the situation is intolerable, and worse than that, the fact that white people in America have no idea what the situation is and don't want to know, and are making no efforts whatever to change it.
Well, you say they're making no effort to change it. You don't believe, then, that since the 1954 Supreme Court ruling, that things have improved in any way for the blacks in America?
As a matter of fact, no, I don't. But the question should not be asked of a man of 46, but a boy of 17. Jonathan Jackson, who just died on August 7th in that courtroom in California, was 17 years old, which means he was born 1 year before that decision. And the question to be asked then of the Americans is not of someone like myself, who may be, after all, by this age, a kind of accommodationist, who maybe wants to believe that there's been a great deal of progress made. But you must ask the people in whose hands the future really lies. It doesn't lie in my hands.
Yes, but you're a writer. You're writing about this. You have a little more perspective.
I have a perspective which is, after all, a perspective of a middle-aged man, which is unusable for people 20 years younger, for one thing. It's and furthermore, let me tell you the truth about that perspective. From my point of view, that near half-century which I represent, has been a record of bad faith and disaster. You know, I cannot honestly face you or the world and say that I really think that the American Negro situation has changed, because it can't change until the white situation in America changes. You know, it is not occurring in a vacuum. I know that as we sit here, that black people are still not in the, you know, for the main part in the labor unions, and I know that when the unemployment rate rises, who gets fired first? I know what that means. I know the effect on the police forces of the present administration, because it liberates them, and especially I know the effect on the police forces in California by the presence of Reagan and Sacramento. And after all, black people live not by their desire in the streets and at the mercy of another violence which Americans pretend does not exist.
Well, do you believe then that the violent reaction that the blacks have had to what you call the violence of white America,
the violence and the really cowardly apathy, the denial that a person like Jonathan Jackson or a person like Angela Davis or even a person like myself has antecedents. After all, we didn't get here, you know, to America yesterday. Behind everyone you've ever heard of, every black person you've heard of, there are hundreds of thousands of porters, maids, junkies, a record of corpses, a record of disaster, which is part of the American history which Americans refuse to read. It isn't something which happened, you know, just because a handful of black people decided to be perverse and go into the streets. They are driven into the streets. They don't have any hope.
Well, do you think that the future
from the government?
Do you think that the future of the blacks in America is wholly linked with the radical section of the whites? In other words, do you think that that is the way that blacks are going to improve themselves?
Well, you use the word improve themselves, which
get themselves out of this intolerable condition.
The radical whites are a very small segment of America, and insofar as the white man becomes a genuine radical, he becomes indistinguishable from the point of view of the powers that rule the country from a nigger. So there's that. And the entire country has been based ever since 1619 on the effort of keeping black and white people apart. Because if there were a coalition, a real coalition between whites and blacks, then Senator Eastland would never have had a job, for one thing. You'd never heard of Governor Wallace and a great many other eminent Americans whose entire role depended on the continued subjugation not only of blacks, but of whites and blacks. Now, some people in America are beginning to realize this, but they're coming to the same end, you know, as black people who realized it for generations.
You think that any number of blacks can challenge the establishment in America, the white establishment, on the grounds of violence? Won't they just get clobbered the way they've been getting clobbered?
For a black man, that's a ridiculous question, because it assumes that if we are quiescent, that we will not be clobbered.
There's a difference between quiescence, isn't there, and extreme violence.
But I keep repeating, I sound like a broken record, that it is not we, the blacks, who have been guilty of the extreme violence. It is not the blacks who go into the police stations looking for subversive material or bombs or tear gas or mace, you know, and terrorize the police. It is the other way around. You know, in all of those extraordinary uprisings, then you count the toll of who's dead, and who's dead is not white people. The violence we are speaking about is in the hands of Americans. It is not in the hands of blacks.
Will you separate blacks and Americans?
I don't make the separation. Americans have made it. They call themselves a silent majority. And as I said to you the other day, said to somebody, it's very dispiriting when the President of the United States is in competition with the governor of Alabama for votes. How would you feel if you were a black American citizen?